If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Acts chapter 24. This is where we will be spending our time today. For everybody in this room, there are going to be times in which you and I are at the mercy of events, wherein evil is kind of having its day with us, where circumstances have placed us into a position where no matter what we do, no matter what we say, we get swept up in some machinery of life, wherein it's aligned against us. There are lies even in this machinery, things that are unjust, and yet we are caught up in it. And we have natural responses to this. One is obviously a frustration that we feel because we have been caught up in machinery about which we have nothing to say and for which we have no responsibility. We've not done anything to cause this to happen to us. And then the other response we have to it is fear. And fear can make it where we just can't go on. I'd like to take a look at this text today and look at Paul's life in it and see if there is something we need that can make us able to go on, even though we might find ourselves unjustly caught up in the machinery of this world. Let's take a look at the text. I'll begin reading in verse 1. After 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and a certain orator or lawyer named Tertullus. These gave evidence to Felix the governor against Paul. When Tertullus was called upon by Felix, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, "Seeing that through you, Felix, we enjoy great peace and prosperity, which is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it. And in all places, most noble Felix, we accept it with thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you or any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. We have found this man Paul to be a plague, a creator of dissension among all of the Jews throughout the world and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, so we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came by and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all of these things of which we accuse him. And the Jews gave assent, maintaining that all of these things were so." So Paul is completely at the mercy now with two groups who have competing agendas, and both of them have control over Paul's life. The first group, the Jews, they want Paul dead. They're tired of Paul. They see Paul as someone who is damaging their relationship to Yahweh, that somehow Deuteronomy chapter 28 is going to be fulfilled in their lifetime. They're going to see God come and do these terrible things because they're apostate as Jews. That's how they see Paul. Then you've got the Romans. They're looking at the Jews and saying, we really don't like the Jews because they're always these kinds of problems. We don't have these problems with other people groups in the Roman Empire, and that's true. Most of the other groups didn't worry about religious questions as the way in which the Jews did. They looked at them as law, and these things have to be. And if they're not, then we've got to, since we can't execute people or stone them anymore, we've got to go to Rome for the solution to these problems. And so they were messing around with Rome a lot, trying to get things like this worked out. And this new way had created so much tension. This gospel of Jesus had created so much tension that now you've got these two competing camps. They don't like each other, but they agree about one thing. Neither one of them likes Paul. This Roman lawyer, Tertullus, starts off by flattering Felix. It's kind of an oily, it made me think of a really large, deep-voiced Southern theatric lawyer in a courtroom here in the South when he started out flattering Felix about all the good things that Felix supposedly had done. It's not all untrue, by the way, which we'll see in just a moment. But the lawyer is there because the Sadducees do not trust themselves to know Roman law well enough to represent themselves here. We have a saying in our culture wherein we say, only a fool represents themselves in a courtroom, and the Sadducees are smart enough to bring somebody in. Now Felix, the person before whom they are, as the judge here, and he's judge, jury, and executioner. There's nobody here advising Felix necessarily. And he is here in full arraignment of power over Paul, over the Jews, and over Judea. Felix, as we know now from having some connection to his personality, he only has one thing that he cares about, and that's Felix. He wants to see Felix do well. And he exercises, as Tacitus says, the Roman historian, he exercised the prerogatives of a king with the spirit of a slave. Now the flatteries that Tertullus, and I'm sure Tertullus is very aware of Felix's personality and background, but the flatteries that Tertullus brings aren't altogether untrue. If you look at the topography of the region, and you look at where Jerusalem is, and you notice all of the roadways going out of Jerusalem, they all pass through canyon lands. And if you watch some of these old Western movies, you know that you'll see the good guys on horses and the bad guys looking down upon them from above them as the horses pass through the canyon lands, and the bad guys use those canyon lands to hide and to ambush the good guys inside the canyons. This is exactly what was taking place coming out of Jerusalem toward Jericho, up toward the plains headed for Antipatris. All of these roadways were dangerous, and Felix, for lack of a better term, had cleaned them up. He had gotten rid of the robbers. So the flatteries weren't altogether undeserved. And Felix had been in charge of Judea when the Egyptian false Messiah had led 4,000 Jews out into the wilderness. The Romans saw that as an insurrection for sure. And they looked at it and said, we've got to catch this guy. They caught the Jews, but the Egyptian got away. And you remember Claudius thought that Paul was that Egyptian. So Felix has done some good things for this region in spite of himself. Now the three accusations brought against Paul were the most dangerous kinds of lies. They're lies mixed up with truth. That is, we're going to take the events and narrate them somewhat correctly, but then stir some lies into it, which makes it all the more dangerous because the charges look like they'll really stick. So what were these charges? Well, one was that Paul had fomented unrest. That's a no-no in the Roman Empire. You just don't do that. Now, it's partially true, but it's true in the same way as, I don't know if you remember when Donald Trump was running for president, and I don't care what you think about Donald Trump, this is just a simple fact of history. He would go to a town, he would rent a hall, he would do everything correctly, he would have security. I mean, he knows the law as well as anybody, what you have to do in order to have a rally of some kind. And there would be these people that would follow Donald Trump around from place to place, and then they would stir up a mob and stir up trouble in these rallies. Well, the news media reported it as Donald Trump's rally causes a riot, as though Donald Trump were responsible for it. This is exactly what is happening to Paul here. He's not responsible for these riots. He's just being Paul. But because he's Paul, these Jews that were following him around through Asia stirred up mobs everywhere he went. And now these Jews are in Jerusalem for Pentecost along with Paul, and they're stirring up a mob here. So it's partially true that Paul's presence has brought these riots, but he's not the one stirring them up. It classifies Paul with insurrection. And Rome has zero tolerance for it. They do not put up with that for even a moment. Second charge was that he was the ringleader of the Nazarenes. Now, Paul's not the ringleader of anything. Paul is just one of the apostles here, and there are many of them now, who are leaders of the church. They're not in any way the leader of the whole game. They're just leaders in the churches where they are. Paul is a traveling evangelist, and so he is kind of a leader for all of the churches, but he's not the leader for the Nazarenes. You got Peter, you got James, you got John, you got others who are seen just as much to be, as Paul calls them himself, the pillars of the faith. they're just as much ringleaders. But Paul's here in trouble. He's the one in charge. So what are they trying to do here? They're trying to link him with false messiahs. That's what they're trying to do. You know, insurrection, you're gathering, to be an insurrectionist, you're gathering a mob to fight against the government. That's the whole plan of insurrection. Well, they're accusing Paul of this here and saying he's a ringleader of these guys that are stirring up this insurrection. So they're, again, making a false linkage. Is it true that Paul is a leader? Absolutely, he is. But he's not the leader, and this idea that somehow he's stirring up an insurrection is simply a false charge, but they're making what I would call a false linkage here. Then the last charge is Paul is a temple defiler. That is, he has done blasphemy to the temple. Now this is just false. The only way they make this stick is they could rightly say, yes, Paul was with Gentiles, because there were some Gentiles that came back with him from Asia, from his mission trip, in order to bring an offering to the Jerusalem church. That's true. And they were Gentiles. That's true. But Paul is a Pharisee of the Pharisees. I mean, he knows well that you don't bring Gentiles into the temple past that doorway and that marker on the doorway that says no Gentiles past here. The court of the Gentiles is where you are. Don't enter past here under threat of death. And the Romans allowed the Jews to enforce that law in their temple. They did. So Paul, he knows the Jewish law better than a lot of these guys sitting on the Sanhedrin. And he knows that you don't bring a Gentile into the temple. So this is just a lie. But it sticks because Paul was with Gentiles. Now just for a moment, and this is hard, but I think it's important, let's grasp the picture here. Let's try to immerse ourselves into this historical moment and see it for what it is. Okay, you got the Romans there. You got all these soldiers who've been brought, there's 70 of them. I don't know if they're all in there, but there are a lot of them in there. They're in all of their Roman uniforms. They've got their thong sandals on that laced up their ankles. They got the little skirts on. They've got their shields all polished up and their belts. They've got their swords. They've got that shiny metal helmet that had the shoe brush on top of it tucked under their arms, and they're all standing there at attention looking very official. Some of them have spears. They are spearmen. You've got them all standing there. Colorful, looking like a military parade. Then you got the Sanhedrin. They've got their robes on. They got all their tassels. I'm sure they had put on their best to show up here in court, and their best for them was a best. I mean, these robes were expensive things. It took a year's salary for the average laborer to even buy a robe or a cloak. And so they're showing up in court before Felix in their very, very best. They want to make an impression. Then you got Felix. Felix, I mean, he was one given to finery. He's kind of like the nobody, the street person that wins the lottery. I mean, for him, he's just probably owns all kinds of fancy chariots and clothes and everything else, because as Tacitus said, the prerogatives of a king with the spirit of a slave. And so he's one of those people that really shouldn't have money but does, and shouldn't have power but does. And I'm sure he's dressed to the nines. His wife, Drusilla, is standing there with him. She's probably in all of her finery. And then you got in the middle of all this scene and the palace where they are, the governor's praetorium, you got Paul. Little old Paul. And the scriptures don't say much about Paul's appearance, but tradition does. And Paul is just this little diminutive Jew that nobody really cares about here. Paul doesn't have any friends in this courtroom. Nobody cares about Paul's life. He's just at the mercy of this machinery. It's like Wormbeer, the guy Wormbeer who was arrested in North Korea about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, and then they finally let him out in a coma, and he died here. Remember that? Well, I don't know if you've gone to YouTube and looked at the trial in North Korea, but just imagine being Wormbeer. I mean, you don't speak the language. You don't know anything about the Korean laws. You don't know anything about any of this. They don't understand you when you speak. You don't understand them. There's nobody representing you. You're an enemy of the state inside the state's house. though that's kind of like what Paul is doing. He's standing there as an enemy of everybody inside the room full of enemies with no friends alongside. How does Paul do this? I mean, we surrender to things, don't we? Sometimes voluntarily. I hate going to the dentist. I love the dentist I have. He's a really good guy. He's got a technique of putting that needle in with that Novocaine where he chases the needle with the Novocaine, and it really doesn't hurt very much. He's really good at it, but I still hate going to the dentist because there's a point at the dentist that I just hate. You know what it is? It's when the chair lays back. For some reason, that is the most vulnerable feeling, to have them lay that chair back, and now you're at their mercy, but we're volunteering for that, right? Well, Paul is here. He's not volunteering for any of this, really. He's at their mercy, and he can't do anything about it. How is it that Paul is so calm here? How does he do this? I bet he remembers his Psalms in moments like this. Psalm 34, I sought Yahweh, and he answered me, and he delivered me from all of my fears. That's an important text to keep in mind for you and me. It doesn't say that he delivered me from my trouble. It says he delivered me from my fears. Fear is the most destructive of human emotions. It has effects upon our physiology, actually. You've got several forms of it. I can't comment on all of them today, but I'd like to look at a couple of them, or three. You've got fear of mortal and immediate danger, wherein you could die. This is an incredible fear. Now, I'm sure this is part of Paul's experience right now. In the 1994 earthquake that took place in Northridge, California, 72 people died. Did you know a sixth of them did not die from anything hitting them or falling on them? A sixth of them, 15, over a sixth, died because, a fifth of them actually, died because they had a heart attack from fear. When the earth moves, there's something primal in us that gives us a primal fear that something that shouldn't move is moving. And these people died because of it, just from fear. Then you've got the fear of the unknown future. That's a kind of a fear that we've all experienced at one time or another. Paul, I'm sure, is experiencing this right now. He doesn't know how this is going to go. And it's a paralyzing fear for some of us, because how do we choose the best thing to do, the best path? What is it? I don't know. Well, I can't decide. I'm so afraid I can't figure out what the best thing to do is, and so we do nothing. It paralyzes us. That's fear. Takes away from us a capacity to make a decision. Then you got the fear of failure, which is kind of like the fear of the future, but it's a little different. This fear creates something known as the Zeigarnik effect in us. Everybody in this room recognizes, they can remember where they were when the planes hit the building on 9/11. Everybody can remember. I can. I can see it so clearly in my mind. I can see the concrete I was standing over. I can see the sunshine. I can see the building that I was working on, the ladders propped up. I can see it all just like I was there again. That's the Zeigarnik effect. This Soviet scientist, psychologist, was studying human memory, and she noticed that there's this intensity of memory connected with intense moments of fear or regret. Fear or regret would create these moments where we remember things extremely well. This is a very important feature of what fear can do. Paul has surrendered himself to the Lord. Paul has set aside all of who he was. If you read Philippians and you see him saying of himself, Pharisee of the Pharisees, born to the tribe of Benjamin, trained under Gamaliel, before the law blameless. That is, I had a career. I had it all going on in the Jewish system, and I gave it all up. As a matter of fact, he says to the church at Philippi, I count it all now as rubbish compared to the upward call of God in Christ Jesus, and compared to gaining Christ. I mean, he's set all that aside. Do you think for 1 minute that Paul isn't human? That he doesn't have an intensive memory planted within him of the moment in which he set all of that aside. And do you think for 1 minute in his humanness that times don't come to him in which he regrets it? Has to. And here he stands in this moment, and every bit of what he let go of is the cause for which he stands in front of this court in this moment. I am sure that Paul's mind is flooded with those kinds of memories. Give him some time in that cell by himself to think, and he remembers. He may have regret. As I was preparing for this sermon, I read a lot of things, and a lot of it never makes it into the sermon, but I thought this was important. It was a 19th century newspaper article back when newspapers printed things like this, and told the story of two fathers who in this particular town, I think it was Chicago, had dying sons. And it recounted the events around their moments with their sons as their sons lay dying. The first father was not a believer, and the paper made note of this. And they recorded this conversation between the father and the son. Son says to the father, "Am I going to die?" Father is silent. He can't answer. He's so caught up, the fear, the regret, all of that that's flooding into his mind at this moment, he can't even utter the words. He's paralyzed by it. The son, of course, I'm sure, in recognizing smelling the pheromones here, recognizes his father's not telling him anything because there really is something going on. I must be in the position of dying. He says, "Well, Dad, if I'm going to die, could you pray for me that Jesus would allow me into heaven?" The father's not a believer. He says nothing. And the son dies. Then you've got the comparison they made with this second father. He is a believer. Same scenario. Child is there dying. Father's there in the room. Child says to the father, "Am I going to die, Daddy?" The father says, "Yes, you are. The doctors have told us they can do nothing more for you. You are going to die." The son says, "Well, Daddy, if I'm going to die, will you pray for me that Jesus will receive me into heaven?" And the father prays. He's a believer. And then when he's done praying, he says something very interesting to the son. He says, "Son," or the child, he says, "You know that you've asked Jesus to forgive you and to accept you into heaven. You don't need me to pray for that." And the child looks at the father and says, "You know, when I do see Jesus, I'm going to tell him that you led me to him." Who do we want to be today? Do we want to be somebody that the Zeigarnik effect takes over and the regrets and the fears that we feel as we encounter the various portions of our lives paralyze us? Or do we want to be like Paul, who in writing to Timothy, his protege, says this, "For this cause I suffer these things, yet I am not ashamed. For I know in whom I have believed, and I am persuaded that he is able to keep for me that which I have committed to him on the last day." Which do we want to be? I'll tell you something. When we go to the Lord, it is not a wrong thing to ask the Spirit of God to give us freedom from fear. It is not a wrong thing. I'm going to look at Paul's life and say, I'm certain that he had done that. He had committed himself to God's hands. He's caught in this machinery, and yet there's no fear in him whatsoever because he knows whom he has trusted, and he trusts himself with him. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything